My name is Karla, and at 30 years old, I discovered that financial freedom meant more than a healthy bank account. It meant escaping the chains my stepfather Harold and mother Sandra had wrapped around me since childhood. That night at Bellagio restaurant changed everything. When my card declined and Harold dragged me to the parking lot, his fists taught me the final lesson I needed. I was done financing my own abuse. If you've ever been made to feel worthless by family who should have protected you, take a moment to subscribe. The justice that follows isn't just my victory, it's for anyone who had to become their own hero when no one else would. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I was 8 years old when my world changed forever. Before Harold, my memories with Mom were simple but happy. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Portland. Money was tight after Dad left, but Sandra worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. She would come home exhausted, but still find energy to help with my homework or make shadow puppets on my bedroom wall before tucking me in. Those nights I felt safe and loved. Everything changed when Sandra met Harold at a company party. She worked as an administrative assistant at an insurance firm, and Harold was a regional sales manager visiting from the Seattle office. She came home that night talking about this charming man who made her laugh for the first time in years. Their whirlwind romance moved faster than I could process. Within 4 months, Harold had transferred to our city, and 3 months after that, they were married in a small ceremony where I was the reluctant flower girl. The first year wasn't terrible. Harold was polite if distant toward me. He brought flowers for Sandra and occasionally remembered to bring me small gifts too. But looking back, the warning signs were there from the beginning. He would make cutting remarks about how expensive it was to raise a child these days. He started tracking every grocery receipt, questioning items Sandra bought for me. The real Harold emerged gradually like a monster rising from murky water. The first time he hit me, I had accidentally spilled juice on his work documents. I was 10. The slap came so fast I didn't even see it coming. Sandra witnessed it but said nothing. That night, I heard them arguing, but by morning she was making his favorite breakfast and telling me to be more careful around Harold's things. From then on, Harold established complete financial control over our household. Sandra surrendered her paychecks to him. He gave her a weekly allowance and scrutinized every purchase. When I needed new clothes for school or money for field trips, Sandra would have to beg him, often waiting until he was in a good mood. By the time I was 12, Harold had convinced Sandra to cash out her modest retirement account to invest in his business ventures. He talked about big returns and future security, but I noticed we never seemed to have more money, only less. Our apartment was traded for a smaller one in a neighborhood where I was afraid to walk alone after school. Math became my refuge. Numbers made sense when nothing else did. My 7th grade teacher, Miss Palmer, noticed my aptitude and gave me extra problems to solve. While other kids complained about homework, I lost myself in equations where there were clear answers, unlike my home life where the rules constantly changed. My grandmother, Sandra's mother, was the only person who saw through Harold. Grandma June lived 3 hours away, but when she visited, she would slip $20 bills into my hand when no one was looking. She told me to save every penny. On my 13th birthday, she secretly opened a savings account for me at her local credit union, mailing me the paperwork. It became our secret project. I would stash away the birthday money from distant relatives and the occasional babysitting jobs I took in our building. The summer I turned 14, Harold lost his job. He told us it was company restructuring, but years later, I would discover he was fired for misappropriating client funds. That was when the physical abuse escalated. Any minor infraction became cause for punishment. If I made too much noise when he was nursing a hangover, or if dinner wasn't ready when he wanted it, his belt would come off. Sandra's excuses for him became more elaborate. He was stressed about finding work. He hadn't been raised right. He was trying his best. When I showed her the bruises, she would cry and promise things would get better, but she never stepped in to protect me. I overheard enough of their late-night arguments to piece together that Harold had gambling debts. He would disappear for entire weekends and return either jubilant with temporary winnings or in a rage that sent Sandra and me walking on eggshells for days. My secret goal became crystal clear: survive until 18, then escape. I studied furiously, knowing education was my only ticket out. When Harold mocked my ambitions, saying college was a waste of money for girls, I nodded and agreed to his face, while applying for every scholarship I could find behind his back. Grandma June became my co-conspirator. She helped me research colleges far from home and coached me through scholarship essays during our phone calls. Harold monitored our home phones, so we developed a code. When I called about recipe questions, she knew to call me back from a friend's house later. By 16, I had mapped out every step of my escape plan. I maintained perfect grades despite the chaos at home. I volunteered at the local library to build my college applications and to spend less time at home. And most importantly, I learned everything I could about money management, saving, and financial independence from the books I devoured during my library shifts. Harold never suspected that the quiet, compliant stepdaughter he belittled was plotting her liberation. Every insult, every blow, every manipulation only strengthened my resolve. I would not only survive this household, I would thrive despite it. The money in my secret account grew slowly but steadily, and with it grew my hope for a future where no one could control me through fear or finances ever again. The day my acceptance letter from State University arrived with a full academic scholarship was both the best and worst day of my high school experience. I had carefully arranged to be the one checking the mail for weeks, knowing decision letters would be arriving. When I saw the thick envelope with the university logo, my hands trembled so badly I could barely tear it open. The full scholarship was beyond my wildest dreams. 4 years of tuition, books, and housing covered. Freedom was within my grasp. That evening, I made the mistake of letting my excitement show. I told Sandra first when Harold wasn't home. She hugged me tightly, and for a brief moment I saw pride in her eyes. That quickly faded to worry. When Harold came home, she blurted out my news before I could stop her. His reaction was predictable, yet still devastating. Harold looked at the acceptance package spread across the kitchen table and scoffed. He picked up the scholarship letter, skimming it with narrowed eyes. My big opportunity for business school, well, who did I think had taught me everything about money and success? If not for him pushing me, I would never have achieved this. And now that his guidance had paid off, it was only right that I help support the family while attending school locally. He tore the housing information in half. I would live at home, commute to save money, and contribute to household expenses with a part-time job. After all, family took care of family. Sandra stood silently by the stove, avoiding my eyes. Later that night, she came to my room and whispered that maybe it was for the best. College was expensive beyond just tuition. I would need their support. Besides, Harold had connections in the business world that could help my future career. I nodded and agreed. Then I waited until they were asleep to call Grandma June from the cordless phone in our bathroom water, running to mask my voice. We finalized our escape plan. 2 months later, I told my parents I was spending the weekend before freshman orientation at a mandatory scholarship recipients event. Instead, Grandma June picked me up at a predetermined location with everything I could fit in 2 suitcases. We drove straight to campus 6 hours away, where I checked into my dormitory and began my new life. The phone calls started that Sunday night. First, Sandra frantic and crying. Then Harold threatening to report me as a runaway, though I was 18, and to contact the university about fraud, though nothing about my scholarship was fraudulent. I changed my phone number the next day. College was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in my life, no one was monitoring my movements or criticizing my choices, but the freedom was almost paralyzing after years of control. I had panic attacks during the first month, convinced Harold would somehow find me and drag me back home. Despite my scholarship, money was still tight. I took 3 part-time jobs, shelving books at the university library, tutoring other students in math, and weekend shifts at a coffee shop near campus. Between work and maintaining the GPA required for my scholarship, I barely slept that first year. Professor Jenkins changed everything. My introduction to finance instructor, a stern woman with silver-streaked black hair and piercing eyes, kept me after class one day during my second semester. I was certain I had done something wrong, but instead she asked why I looked so exhausted all the time when my work was consistently excellent. Something about her direct yet compassionate approach broke through my carefully constructed walls. I told her about juggling multiple jobs while maintaining my grades. I didn't mention Harold or my escape, but she seemed to read between the lines. She offered me a position as her research assistant, which paid better than all 3 of my other jobs combined for fewer hours. Under her mentorship, my understanding of financial systems blossomed from basic interest into genuine expertise. During my sophomore year, Sandra somehow obtained my new phone number. Her first voicemail was full of tears and guilt. Harold had been inconsolable when I left. He had lost his new job. They were struggling financially. If I could just send a little money to help with their mortgage payment just this once. I sent $300 from my savings. It was the first of many financial emergencies over the next 3 years. A broken furnace in winter, medical bills when Sandra fell and broke her wrist, car repairs. Each time I told myself it would be the last time. Each time I sent money I could barely afford to part with. In my junior year, I met Tyler in my advanced investment strategies class. Smart, funny, and kind, he pursued me with a patience I didn't know how to respond to. I was used to calculating the cost of everything, weighing risks against rewards. His genuine interest in me without apparent ulterior motive confused my defensive systems. On our 5th date, he gently asked about my family. I gave vague answers, but he noticed how I tensed at certain questions. Instead of pushing, he shared about his own complicated family dynamics with an alcoholic father. Slowly, over late-night study sessions and weekend hikes, I began to trust him with pieces of my story. He never judged or offered simplistic solutions. Instead, he gave me books about trauma and the cycle of abuse. Through his compassionate perspective, I began to understand that what had happened to me wasn't normal or acceptable. When I graduated with highest honors, Tyler and Grandma June were there cheering for me. Sandra had promised to come, but called the night before with another emergency. Harold had forbidden her to attend my graduation after our latest argument about money. My first job offer came from Westridge Financial Advisors, a prestigious firm where I had interned during my senior year. The starting salary was more money than I had ever imagined earning. When I called Sandra to share my news, she seemed genuinely happy for me. Then she put Harold on the phone. He spoke as if the past 4 years of minimal contact had never happened. He took credit for my success, saying his tough love had prepared me for the real world. Then he explained that now that I was making good money, I could help them refinance their house. He had already spoken to a mortgage broker about my income serving as a guarantor for their loan. For the first time, I directly refused him. The silence on the phone was deafening, followed by a tirade of verbal abuse so vicious that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. He called me selfish, ungrateful, a terrible daughter. When I ended the call, I was shaking but also strangely empowered. That night, I made my first adult boundary with my family. I texted Sandra that I would maintain a relationship with her, but I would not be speaking with Harold or participating in any financial discussions involving him. If she respected this boundary, I would be happy to have monthly calls with her. She didn't respond for 3 weeks. When she finally did, it was to say Harold had been hospitalized with chest pains due to the stress I had caused him. The emotional manipulation was familiar, but this time I recognized it for what it was. The first 5 years of my career passed in a blur of 60-hour work weeks, client meetings, and rapid promotions. I discovered I had a natural talent for helping people understand and grow their investments. My traumatic background gave me unusual insight into the emotional aspects of money management that many of my colleagues lacked. By 27, I had been promoted to senior financial advisor and had built a solid client base. My apartment, though small, was in a secure building with a doorman. I bought my first new car. I took actual vacations. These normal adult milestones felt like miracles to someone who had grown up hiding food in her bedroom for days when Harold was in one of his moods. Tyler and I had dated throughout this time, weathering the stresses of early careers and my ongoing family drama. He proposed on a weekend trip to the mountains, and I surprised myself by saying yes immediately. The trust he had patiently built with me over years had created a foundation I never thought possible. Despite my professional success and personal happiness, Sandra remained a direct line to my past trauma. Our monthly calls had evolved into regular requests for financial assistance, always presented as dire emergencies that couldn't wait. The furnace finally died completely. $4,000. Sandra needed dental work, not covered by insurance. $3,000. The roof was leaking and causing water damage. $6,000. Harold had a fender bender without adequate insurance. $5,000. I paid each time, telling myself I was helping my mother, not my abuser. But Harold benefited from every dollar, a fact that made me physically ill when I allowed myself to think about it. Tyler gently suggested therapy after I had a panic attack, when a particularly large request came the day after we put a deposit down on our wedding venue. Dr. Marshall, a therapist specializing in childhood trauma and financial abuse, helped me see patterns I had been blind to. During our third session, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. If I knew a client was being financially exploited the way I was, what would I advise them? The professional advice I would give others was so clear, yet I couldn't apply it to myself. The cognitive dissonance was startling. At work, I befriended Jasmine, a new financial advisor who had escaped an abusive marriage. Her perspective was refreshingly direct. When I mentioned sending money for yet another household repair at my mother's house, she asked pointedly, "Why am I subsidizing the lifestyle of a man who used to beat me?" I had no good answer. My 30th birthday marked a turning point. Sandra called not to wish me happy birthday, but to tell me she had been diagnosed with hypertension. The doctor said stress was a contributing factor. If only they weren't constantly worried about money. If only they could catch up on their bills. If only their successful daughter would help a little more. That night I opened a spreadsheet and began documenting every dollar I had sent to Sandra and Harold since college. The total made me physically ill. Over $80,000 over 12 years. Money that could have gone toward my retirement, a home purchase, or simply my peace of mind, had instead gone to support the man who had terrorized my childhood. More disturbing was the pattern that emerged. The requests had started small and infrequent, but had grown larger and more regular. There was always a crisis, always an emergency, always a reason why this time was different and would solve their problems for good. A week later, my bank notified me of suspicious activity on my accounts. Someone had attempted to access my online banking using my social security number and birth date. The IP address traced back to my hometown. When confronted, Sandra admitted that Harold had been trying to check my accounts to see how much money I really had because he was convinced I was lying about my finances to avoid helping them more. The violation catalyzed something in me. I began researching Harold more thoroughly using financial databases I had access to through my work. What I discovered confirmed suspicions I had harbored since childhood. Harold had a gambling problem that had only worsened over time. He had taken out multiple payday loans in recent years. There were tax liens against their property. And most disturbing of all, he had a history of failed businesses where investors lost everything while he somehow walked away unscathed. I began to wonder if there was more to the story than just bad luck and poor money management. Using my professional knowledge, I discreetly looked into his past business dealings and discovered patterns that suggested deliberate fraud rather than mere incompetence. Meanwhile, Sandra's health provided a new avenue for manipulation. Her doctor had recommended reducing her work hours due to her blood pressure, which meant less household income. Harold called me directly for the first time in years, leaving voicemails alternating between threatening and cajoling. I owed them. They had raised me. Sandra was sick because of my selfishness. Did I want her death on my conscience? Or I was their successful daughter whom they were so proud of. They had always believed in me. They just needed a little help during this rough patch. A promotion to divisional manager came with a substantial salary increase, and my picture in the company newsletter. Somehow, Harold saw it. His next call congratulated me on my success and smoothly transitioned to explaining that now was the perfect time for me to help them refinance their mortgage with me as a co-signer. The final straw came when I received a call from a collection agency looking for Harold at my number, which he had listed as his contact. He had taken out a personal loan using my address without my knowledge. That night, I confided everything to my friend Audrey, who worked as an investigator with the IRS. Without providing specific names, I outlined what I had discovered about Harold's financial activities. Her expression grew increasingly grave as I spoke. What I was describing, she explained, sounded like potential tax evasion, possibly fraud, and definitely identity theft if he was using my information without consent. These weren't just moral failings, they were crimes. For the first time, I saw a potential path to freedom that didn't involve simply running away or paying for peace. But first, I needed to make a clean break. I changed my phone number again. I moved to a new apartment and didn't provide Sandra with the address. I consulted with an attorney named Rachel about how to protect myself legally from any future attempts by Harold to use my identity or credit. Most importantly, I stopped sending money. Cold turkey. No matter how desperate the messages forwarded through mutual acquaintances became, no matter how many tearful voicemails Sandra left with my assistant at work, I stood firm. The guilt was overwhelming at first. Dr. Marshall helped me work through it session by session. We explored the difference between being responsible to someone versus being responsible for them. We unpacked the toxic belief that I somehow owed financial support to people who had abused me. We practiced responses to the inevitable escalation that would come when Harold realized his cash flow had been cut off. I was done financing my own abuse. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. And it set the stage for the confrontation that would change everything. 2 months after I cut off financial support, Sandra called my office repeatedly until my assistant put her through. Her voice was shaky, hesitant, in a way that immediately put me on alert. Harold was turning 50. He wanted to reconcile. He regretted how things had gone between us. Wouldn't I consider meeting them for a birthday dinner? Just one evening to start healing our family. Every instinct told me to refuse, but Sandra sounded so hopeful. Dr. Marshall and I had discussed the possibility of establishing a new relationship with my mother, with appropriate boundaries. Maybe this could be a first step as long as I maintained firm financial boundaries. I agreed to dinner with conditions. A public place I would meet them there, rather than riding together, and absolutely no discussion of money or financial assistance. Harold selected Bellagio, the most expensive restaurant in the city. Of course he did. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. He chose a venue he knew he couldn't afford on his own as a power play. When I arrived precisely on time for our 7:30 reservation, I found the hostess apologetic. My party was already seated, she explained. Mr. Brooks had arrived with additional guests and requested a larger table. Unfortunately, the only table large enough on short notice was near the kitchen. My heart sank. Harold had invited others without telling me, and we were seated at the worst table in the restaurant despite my careful planning and early reservation. The power games had begun before I even sat down. As I approached the table, I saw Harold holding court with Sandra and 3 other couples I vaguely recognized as their friends. The men were loud, already working on a second bottle of wine. Sandra sat quietly beside Harold, her smile strained when she saw me. Harold made a show of standing and announcing my arrival to the table. My accomplished stepdaughter, the financial wizard of Wall Street. The introduction was both inaccurate and designed to set me up as the wealthy provider for the evening. I took the only empty seat wedged between the swinging kitchen door and Harold's friend whose name I couldn't remember. Every few minutes, servers would push through the door, bringing a blast of kitchen noise and heat each time. Harold ordered another bottle of wine without consulting me, then prompted everyone to study the menus. Look at the prices, he joked. Karla can afford it. The women laughed nervously while the men studied the most expensive items with sudden interest. When the waiter came to take orders, Harold went first, selecting the dry-aged porterhouse, the most expensive steak on the menu. He encouraged everyone else to order whatever they wanted. My treat, he kept saying, though it was clearly not his treat at all. One by one, everyone ordered expensive entrees, appetizers, and additional sides. Sandra chose the least expensive pasta dish, her eyes downcast. When it was my turn, I ordered a simple salad, suddenly not hungry at all. The waiter, a professional with kind eyes who clearly read the situation correctly, gave me a sympathetic look as he collected the menus. Throughout the meal, he checked on me more attentively than the others, a small kindness that nearly brought me to tears. As the food arrived, Harold dominated the conversation with stories about his business ventures and connections to important people. He was pitching his friends on a new investment opportunity, I realized. A restaurant franchise concept that needed initial investors but promised significant returns within a year. I recognized the pattern from my research. Harold would start a business with investor money, skim funds for himself, then let the business fail while blaming market conditions. The investors would lose everything while Harold moved on to the next scheme. One of the men asked about my professional opinion on the investment opportunity. Before I could answer, Harold laughed loudly. Karla deals with boring retirement accounts and stock portfolios. This is real entrepreneurship, not spreadsheet management. Throughout the meal, Harold became increasingly intoxicated and belligerent. He sent back his perfectly cooked steak, demanding a replacement. He criticized the wine he had selected. He snapped his fingers at servers. Most painfully, he treated me like a servant rather than a dinner guest. Karla, tell the waiter we need more bread. Karla, this wine is too warm. Do something about it. Each command delivered with a smirk that dared me to contradict him in front of his audience. Sandra watched this performance with the same passive acceptance she had shown throughout my childhood. Occasionally, she would touch Harold's arm when he became too loud, but otherwise made no attempt to intervene or support me. Dessert brought a new humiliation. Harold ordered the most expensive option for everyone at the table, without asking if anyone actually wanted dessert. Then he disappeared to the restroom just as the check arrived. I knew what he was doing. He had orchestrated this entire evening to force me back into the role of family provider. By disappearing when the bill came, he created a situation where I would either have to pay or face embarrassment in front of his friends. The bill was staggering, over $1,200 with wine, appetizers, entrees, desserts, and the additional guests I hadn't planned for. I handed the waiter my credit card, wanting only for this ordeal to end. Minutes later, the waiter returned with a concerned expression. Miss Brooks, your card has been declined. The table fell silent. Harold, who had conveniently returned from the restroom just in time to witness my humiliation, made a show of concern that didn't reach his eyes. Money troubles, Karla? I thought you were doing so well at your fancy job. My face burned with embarrassment, but I maintained my composure. I reached for my phone to check my banking app, discovering a fraud alert had frozen my card due to the unusually large transaction at a restaurant I had never visited before. I quickly called the bank to authorize the charge, but the damage to my dignity had been done. Harold had achieved his goal. He had manufactured a situation where I appeared financially irresponsible in front of his friends, undermining both my professional credibility and personal autonomy. As we left the restaurant, Harold insisted on walking me to my car despite my protests. Once we were out of sight of the others in the dark parking lot, his demeanor changed completely. The jovial host vanished, replaced by the menacing bully of my childhood. You embarrassed me in front of my friends, he hissed, his breath hot with alcohol and rage. I tried to step around him to reach my car door. That was when he grabbed my arm, squeezing so hard I knew it would leave bruises. You think you're too good for this family now. You think your money makes you better than us. When I tried to pull away, his open hand connected with my face, the sound of the slap echoing in the empty parking lot. The blow was so unexpected, so reminiscent of my childhood terror that I froze. That was when I saw Sandra standing several yards away watching. She had followed us, perhaps sensing what was coming. But instead of intervening, she simply stood there, a passive witness to my humiliation and pain as she had been throughout my childhood. I broke free of Harold's grip and quickly got into my car, locking the doors. As I drove away, I caught a final glimpse of them in my rearview mirror. Harold gesturing angrily, Sandra placing a calming hand on his arm. Later that night, Sandra called. I picked up, still in shock from the evening's events. Harold was just upset, she explained. I had embarrassed him with the credit card situation. Why did I have to be so difficult? If I had just helped them with their mortgage, as Harold had asked, none of this would have happened. In that moment, I saw with perfect clarity that nothing had changed and nothing would ever change as long as I participated in their dysfunction. The only person who could break this cycle was me. I hung up mid-sentence and blocked both their numbers. Then I took photographs of the bruises forming on my arm and the red mark on my face. The documentation of physical abuse was the first step in my plan. The financial evidence I had been gathering would be the second, and the anonymous tip to the IRS would be the third. That night, as I applied ice to my throbbing cheek, I made a decision. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about finally escaping the cycle of abuse that had defined my entire life. And perhaps most importantly, it was about making sure Harold could never do to anyone else what he had done to me and my mother. The morning after the disastrous birthday dinner, I woke up with a clarity I had never experienced before. The bruises on my arm had darkened overnight, 5 distinct fingerprints marking where Harold had grabbed me. My cheek still showed a faint redness. I photographed both again in the morning light, documenting the progression of the injuries. Tyler was furious when he saw the bruises, insisting we go to the police immediately. I hesitated. Years of conditioning, making me question whether filing a report would only escalate the situation. But Tyler's unwavering support gave me the courage to drive to the police station that afternoon. Officer Ramirez took my statement with professional compassion. She photographed my injuries for the official record and asked detailed questions about the incident. When I mentioned that this was part of a lifelong pattern of abuse, her eyes softened with understanding. Filing a police report for assault was just the beginning. The physical abuse, while traumatic, was only one facet of Harold's violence. The financial abuse and potential crimes required a different approach. I took a personal day from work and began organizing the financial evidence I had gathered over the previous months. Bank statements showing the money I had sent to Sandra and Harold over the years. Documentation of Harold's failed businesses, the collection notice using my address, the alert about the attempted access to my bank accounts. Looking at it all laid out chronologically created a damning picture. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events or poor decisions. This was a pattern of deliberate exploitation and potentially criminal financial behavior. My next step required careful consideration. I knew enough from my professional background to recognize signs of tax evasion and fraudulent business practices, but I needed expert guidance on how to proceed. I called Audrey and asked if she could meet me for coffee that weekend. At a quiet table in a cafe far from my usual haunts, I showed her key pieces of evidence, still keeping the names anonymous. Audrey reviewed everything with a professional eye, occasionally making notes. When she looked up, her expression was serious. "The person you're describing has likely committed multiple financial crimes," she said. "The pattern of starting businesses, collecting investor money, and then having the businesses fail while maintaining a lifestyle that doesn't match reported income strongly suggests both investor fraud and tax evasion." She explained the process of reporting suspected tax fraud to the IRS. An anonymous tip could be submitted with supporting evidence. The IRS would evaluate the information and decide whether to launch an investigation. If they find evidence of criminal activity, she said, they don't just issue fines. Tax evasion and fraud can carry prison sentences. The thought of Harold in prison gave me no pleasure. What I wanted was justice and protection, not revenge. But I also knew that without serious consequences, he would continue exploiting vulnerable people, including my mother. For the next 2 weeks, I methodically built my case. I requested old tax records from the county assessor's office for properties Harold had owned. I documented the discrepancies between his apparent income and his lifestyle. I created timelines of his business ventures, noting the pattern of investor recruitment followed by business failure. Meanwhile, Harold and Sandra escalated their attempts to contact me. They called my office so frequently that I had to ask our receptionist to block their numbers. They showed up at my previous apartment only to learn from neighbors that I had moved. Sandra even tried to reach me through Tyler's workplace, claiming a family emergency. The isolation I had feared never materialized. Instead, I found myself surrounded by people who supported my decision to break free from toxic family dynamics. Tyler unwavering in his commitment to our future together. Dr. Marshall providing professional guidance through each emotional hurdle. My friends from work who closed ranks around me when Harold attempted to ambush me in the office lobby one afternoon. Most surprisingly distant relatives began reaching out after hearing distorted versions of events from Sandra. My cousin Megan, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, called to check if I was really having a nervous breakdown as Sandra had claimed. Instead, she found me more centered and determined than ever. After hearing a brief version of the truth, she shared that Harold had borrowed money from her parents years ago that was never repaid. I wasn't the only victim, just the most consistent source of funds. When I felt my case was strong enough, I met with Rachel, an attorney specializing in financial crimes. I wanted to ensure that my actions were legally sound and that I had protected myself from any potential backlash. Rachel reviewed my documentation and nodded approvingly. "You've been extremely thorough," she said. "But before you submit this to the IRS, you need to understand the potential consequences. This will likely lead to a full investigation of both Harold and Sandra. Your mother may face legal jeopardy as well if she was knowingly participating in tax fraud." This gave me pause. Despite everything I didn't want to see Sandra prosecuted, she was as much Harold's victim as I was, even if she had enabled his abuse. Rachel advised me to focus my evidence specifically on Harold's activities where Sandra wasn't directly involved. The businesses formed solely in his name, the investment schemes he ran independently, the properties he had bought and sold through his business entities. With this guidance, I refined my documentation to create the strongest case possible against Harold while minimizing Sandra's exposure. I couldn't completely protect her from the consequences of her choices, but I could try to ensure that the full weight of prosecution fell on the primary perpetrator. 3 months after the restaurant incident, I was ready. I had assembled a comprehensive file documenting years of suspicious financial activity. I had protected my own finances by placing fraud alerts on my credit reports, changing all my passwords, and creating a new email address for professional communications. I had even moved to a building with security to prevent any unwanted visits. The final step was the hardest. Audrey had explained that while IRS tips can be anonymous, the most effective ones include contact information, so investigators can request additional information if needed. This meant potentially being identified as the source of the tip if the case went to court. After careful consideration and discussions with Rachel about witness protection options, I decided to provide my contact information with the report. Harold had controlled my life through fear for too long. I refused to hide any longer. The night before I submitted the report, Sandra left a voicemail that nearly broke my resolve. Her voice was small, frightened in a way I had rarely heard. "Karla, please call me when Harold isn't home. Things are bad here, really bad. He knows you have some financial information about him and he's scared. I've never seen him like this. Please, whatever you're planning to do, reconsider. He says he'll change. He promises things will be different." I saved the voicemail as evidence of Harold's awareness of his own criminal liability. Then I called Sandra back from a blocked number, timing the call for when I knew Harold would be at his regular afternoon bar meeting with business associates. "Mom," I said when she answered, "I can't stop what's coming and I don't want to. This isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. Harold has hurt too many people for too long." She began to cry soft, hopeless sounds that reminded me of nights hiding in my bedroom as a child. "I love him, Karla. despite everything I love him. I know, Mom. But loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy you or others. You deserve better than living in fear. What will I do if they take him away? She whispered. For the first time, I heard the real question beneath her fear. Not how will I manage emotionally, but how will I survive financially? Harold had made her so dependent that even the thought of independence terrified her. You'll be free, Mom, and I'll help you build a new life if you want, but not like before, not by enabling Harold or letting him control either of us through money. There was a long silence on the line. Then Sandra said something that confirmed I was making the right choice. He knows you have evidence. He's been destroying papers and moving money between accounts. He said if anyone comes asking questions, I need to say I handled all the family finances. He was planning to make Sandra take the fall if he was investigated. My gentle, broken mother who had failed to protect me but who remained a victim herself. The next morning, I submitted my report to the IRS with a steady hand and resolved heart. This wasn't about revenge. This was about breaking a cycle of abuse that had controlled too many lives for too long. Harold had written countless financial bills over the years, extracting payment through manipulation threats and violence. Now the bill he would receive would come from an authority he couldn't intimidate or control. It would come from the IRS. 2 weeks after submitting my report to the IRS, I received a call from an unfamiliar number during my lunch break. The caller identified himself as Special Agent Donovan with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They were reviewing my information and needed to ask some clarifying questions. Could I come to their office that Friday? The meeting lasted 4 hours. I walked them through my documentation, chronologically explaining connections between seemingly unrelated business entities that were actually all controlled by Harold. I provided copies of communications showing his intent to deceive investors. I shared the recording of Sandra's call about Harold destroying documents and moving money, which particularly interested the agents. As I left the federal building that afternoon, I felt lighter somehow. The burden of knowledge I had carried alone for so long had been transferred to authorities with the power to act on it. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. I didn't have to wait long for developments. 3 days later, Sandra called from a new number, her voice shaking so badly I could hardly understand her. They came to the house this morning, she said. Men in suits with badges. They had papers. They took Harold's computer and boxes of documents from his office. What did you do, Karla? I took a deep breath. I told the truth, Mom. That's all. Her sob was sudden and wrenching. He says you've destroyed our family. He says you did this for revenge because of some argument about a dinner bill. He's calling everyone we know, telling them you've gone crazy. Let him talk, I said, surprised by my own calmness. The evidence speaks for itself. After that call, I knew a direct confrontation was inevitable. Harold would not go quietly as his financial house of cards collapsed. He would lash out, trying to intimidate me into withdrawing my cooperation with the investigation. Rather than waiting for him to ambush me, I decided to control the time and place of our final meeting. I texted Sandra suggesting coffee at a busy cafe in the financial district where my firm was located. I knew security cameras covered the entire space, and several colleagues would be dining there during the time I suggested. Sandra agreed immediately. I doubt she told Harold it was my suggestion, likely presenting it to him as her own idea for getting me to back off. They arrived together 15 minutes late, a power move I had anticipated. I had selected a table with my back to the wall with a clear view of both the entrance and the exit. As they approached, I took a quick assessment. Harold looked terrible. His usual confident swagger was gone, replaced by a barely controlled fury evident in his clenched jaw and rigid posture. Sandra walked slightly behind him, her eyes darting nervously around the cafe. I had prepared a folder containing copies of key financial documents with the most damning evidence highlighted. As they sat down, I placed it on the table between us, my hand resting lightly on top of it. Before Harold could speak, I took control of the conversation. I've documented every dollar I've given you over the past 12 years, I said, opening the folder to the spreadsheet I had created. $84,632.47 to be exact. Money taken through manipulation, guilt, and threats. Harold's face reddened, but I continued before he could interrupt. I'm not here to ask for it back. I'm here to tell you that it stops now, completely and permanently. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. You ungrateful little bitch, after everything we did for you. I maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. What exactly did you do for me, Harold? Beat me, belittle me, use me as your personal ATM? Sandra made a small sound of distress. This isn't helping anything, she said. We should be trying to work things out as a family. I turned to her, gentling my voice. There is no working this out, Mom. Not anymore. Harold has been running financial scams for years. He's stolen from investors, evaded taxes, and attempted to use my identity for his schemes. These aren't family disagreements. They're crimes. Harold slammed his hand down on the table, causing nearby diners to turn and stare. His voice rose as he lost the tenuous grip on his temper. You think you know everything with your fancy degree and your spreadsheets. You have no idea what it takes to run a business in the real world. I remained calm, which only infuriated him more. I know the difference between legitimate business losses and fraud. I know the difference between financial hardship and deliberate tax evasion. And now the IRS knows too. At the mention of the IRS, Harold's expression changed from anger to something more calculating. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to one I recognized from childhood, the reasonable voice he used when trying to manipulate me into compliance. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. Every businessman has complicated finances. I'm sure we can clear this up. If you tell the IRS you made a mistake, that you misinterpreted some documents, this can all go away. I shook my head. The evidence doesn't lie, Harold. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. You have no idea what you've started. I have friends who can make your life very difficult. Your job, your relationship, your future, I can destroy it all with a few phone calls. For the first time in our conversation, I smiled. Are you threatening me in a public place with witnesses and cameras? After the assault charge I already filed for the restaurant incident, please continue. It will make an interesting addition to my statement. Harold's face went from red to white as he realized his tactical error. Sandra placed a restraining hand on his arm, sensing the dangerous precipice he stood on. His next approach was as predictable as it was pathetic. Tears welled in his eyes, and his voice took on a pleading quality that might have seemed genuine to someone who didn't know him as I did. Karla, I know I wasn't perfect. I had a difficult childhood myself. I did the best I could as a stepfather. If I was too harsh sometimes, it was because I wanted you to be strong for the real world. We're family. Families forgive. I had expected every manipulation tactic he was deploying, had prepared responses for each. What I hadn't anticipated was my own emotional reaction to this final confrontation. Not fear or anger or even satisfaction, but a profound sadness for the years lost to his abuse and my own compliance. I stood up, gathering the folder of evidence. This meeting is over. I've said what I came to say. The financial support is finished. The emotional manipulation is finished. Our relationship, such as it was, is finished. I looked at Sandra, whose tears were silent but genuine. Mom, when you're ready to leave him, call me. I'll help you, but not while you're with him. Harold's final attempt to regain control was the most desperate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a check, sliding it across the table toward me. $10,000, he said, a token of my regret. Take it and we can put this misunderstanding behind us. I recognized the bribery attempt for what it was, a pathetic effort to buy my silence and cooperation with the very same financial manipulation he had always used. The amount was significant enough to show his desperation, but not so large that it would impact the offshore accounts I suspected he maintained. I left the check on the table and walked away without another word, Harold's threats and Sandra's sobs following me out the door. 3 days later, my phone lit up with messages from former neighbors and distant relatives. Federal agents had executed a search warrant at Harold and Sandra's home. Computers, files, and financial records had been removed in boxes. Harold had been taken in for questioning. The investigation moved with surprising speed after that. Harold's attempts to destroy evidence and hide assets had only created more proof of his criminal intent. The IRS investigators found offshore accounts, shell companies, and a pattern of investor fraud going back over 15 years. When Sandra finally called me 2 weeks after our cafe confrontation, her voice was different, subdued but somehow stronger. "They've frozen all our accounts," she said. "The mortgage payment is due next week and I can't access any money. Harold says it's all your fault, that you've ruined us to get revenge." I listened patiently, then asked the question I'd been waiting years to ask. "Do you still believe him, Mom? After everything that's happened, do you still think he's the victim here?" Her silence spoke volumes. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know I'm scared." It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in years. "Come stay with me," I offered. "Just until you figure things out. No strings attached." She refused that day, but 3 days later, after Harold had been formally charged with multiple counts of tax evasion, wire fraud, and investor fraud, she called back. Her voice was steady despite the circumstances. "Is that offer still open?" The news of Harold's arrest made the local business pages. Former investors came forward with additional allegations. The carefully constructed facade of the successful businessman crumbled, completely revealing the criminal beneath. 6 weeks after our cafe confrontation, I received an official letter from the IRS, thanking me for my cooperation and informing me that my documentation had been instrumental in building their case. The investigation had expanded beyond tax issues to include wire fraud, identity theft, and securities violations. Harold now faced charges from multiple federal agencies. Sandra moved into my guest room temporarily. Those first weeks were awkward, painful, as we navigated a relationship built on decades of dysfunction. But slowly, with the help of joint therapy sessions, we began to rebuild something resembling a mother-daughter bond. One evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the sunset, Sandra spoke the words I had waited a lifetime to hear. "I'm sorry, Karla. I failed you as a mother. I chose him over you again and again, and there's no excuse for that. I was weak and afraid, but that doesn't justify what I let happen to you." I took her hand, this broken woman, who had finally found her voice after decades of silence. "I forgive you, Mom. Not for Harold, never for him. But for us, I forgive you." The preliminary hearing for Harold's case was scheduled for the following month. Both Sandra and I had been called as witnesses. The prosecutor warned us that Harold's defense would likely try to paint me as a vindictive daughter and Sandra as a confused, financially naive spouse who knew nothing of her husband's dealings. We were ready. The truth so long suppressed would finally be spoken aloud in a court of law. Harold would face justice not just for his financial crimes but for the years of abuse he had inflicted on both of us. The system wasn't perfect, but it offered something Harold had never provided: accountability. The man who had controlled our lives through money and fear would now answer to a power greater than himself. And we would be there to witness it, 2 women reclaiming their stories and their lives after years of silence. 6 months after Harold's arrest, the world had transformed into something I hardly recognized. The courtroom, with its solemn procedures and relentless documentation, had accomplished what years of personal struggle could not. Harold had been convicted on 11 counts of tax evasion, wire fraud, and investor fraud. His sentencing was scheduled for the following month, with federal guidelines suggesting a minimum of 8 years in prison. Sandra had filed for divorce, a process complicated by the asset freeze and ongoing financial investigations, but supported by a court-appointed advocate specializing in cases involving financial abuse. She had moved from my guest room into a small apartment of her own, funded partially by victim restitution funds and partially by legitimate work as an office manager at a local nonprofit. I had taken a 3-month sabbatical from my firm after the trial, using the time to heal and reassess my life priorities. The constant stress of the previous year had taken its toll, manifesting in migraines, insomnia, and anxiety attacks that even Tyler's patient support couldn't always soothe. Dr. Marshall increased our sessions to twice weekly during this period. We worked through the complex emotions that had surfaced after the trial, relief that Harold would face consequences, guilt over Sandra's financial struggles, lingering anger at the years of abuse, and most surprisingly, grief for the prior family I had never really had. "You're mourning the childhood you deserved but didn't get," Dr. Marshall explained during one particularly difficult session. "And you're mourning the parents who should have protected and nurtured you. That grief is valid and necessary." Slowly, as spring turned to summer, I began to rebuild my life around my own values, rather than in reaction to Harold's abuse. Tyler and I rescheduled our wedding, choosing a small ceremony focused on celebrating our commitment rather than impressing guests. We bought a house with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers, a simple pleasure denied to me in my chaotic childhood. Most significantly, I began to explore ways to transform my painful experiences into something meaningful for others. The financial knowledge that had been my escape route could become a lifeline for other abuse survivors. I approached my firm with a proposal for a new division, specializing in financial recovery and education for survivors of domestic abuse and financial exploitation. To my surprise, the partners were immediately supportive, recognizing both the social value and the business potential of the initiative. Working with local domestic violence shelters, I developed a curriculum covering basic financial literacy, credit repair, debt management, and long-term financial planning, specifically tailored to abuse survivors. Many participants had financial histories similar to Sandra's, their economic independence systematically dismantled by controlling partners. Teaching these classes became the most rewarding aspect of my professional life. Watching women and men who had been financially exploited regain confidence in their ability to manage money and build security brought healing I hadn't expected. One Tuesday evening, after a particularly powerful class where a participant shared her first successful budget, I returned home to find Sandra waiting on my porch with a small gift bag. Inside was a framed photograph I had never seen before of me, at about 6 years old, laughing on a swing with my arms stretched toward the sky. "I took this the summer before I met Harold," Sandra explained, her voice steady but sad. "You were so fearless then. You believed you could fly if you just swung high enough. I wanted you to have it, to remember that you were joyful once before everything happened, and to tell you that I see that same joy returning now." It was the first gift from my mother in years that didn't come with strings attached or Harold's influence behind it. We sat on the porch swing together as the evening cooled around us, talking not about the past but about our hopes for the future. Small steps toward a new kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect, rather than fear and obligation. As the 1-year anniversary of the restaurant incident approached, I received an unexpected call from Grandma June. At 84, she had moved to an assisted living facility in Arizona, but her mind remained sharp as ever. "I always knew you would break free," she said. "You were too smart, too strong to stay trapped forever. I just wish I could have done more to help you sooner." "You did enough," I assured her. "That secret bank account you started for me was the first time I realized I could have a future different from my present. You planted the seed of possibility." The weekend before Harold's sentencing, Tyler and I flew to Arizona to visit Grandma June. The woman who had slipped $20 bills into my hand and whispered encouragement when everyone else was enabling abuse deserved to know the impact of her small acts of resistance. We celebrated with a dinner at her favorite local restaurant, where she proudly introduced me to all the staff and several residents who joined our table. "This is my granddaughter, the financial advisor," she announced repeatedly. "She's helping other women escape bad situations. She's breaking the cycle." The sentencing hearing was anticlimactic in many ways. Harold, once imposing and terrifying, appeared diminished in his orange jumpsuit, his arrogance replaced by a simmering resentment, as the judge delivered his fate: 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole until at least 10 years served. Sandra sat beside me in the courtroom, her back straight, her eyes never leaving Harold as the sentence was pronounced. When the guards led him away, she reached for my hand and squeezed once hard. "It's really over," she whispered. "But endings are also beginnings." As summer turned to fall, my financial education program expanded to 3 more shelters across the state. Sandra volunteered as a program assistant, her first-hand experience with financial abuse, providing insights that even my professional knowledge couldn't match. Tyler and I married in October, a small garden ceremony with Grandma June arriving from Arizona as the guest of honor. Sandra, still finding her place in my adult life, helped arrange flowers and served cake with an awkward eagerness that spoke to her desire to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. The night before my return to full-time work after my sabbatical, I sat in the garden Tyler and I had planted together, reflecting on the journey of the past 18 months. From the humiliation of that restaurant table by the kitchen to the confrontation in the cafe to the courtroom where justice was finally served, each step had required courage I hadn't known I possessed until tested. The financial abuse that had defined my relationship with Harold for so many years had ultimately been his downfall. The very control mechanism he had used to dominate and exploit had become the evidence that ensured his conviction. There was a certain poetic justice in that outcome that brought not celebration but a quiet satisfaction. More importantly, the skills I had developed to survive my understanding of money and power dynamics had become tools for helping others escape similar situations. The pain had been transformed into purpose, the trauma into testimony that other survivors found hope in. I still had difficult days. Therapy with Dr. Marshall continued, though less frequently. Certain triggers like unexpected financial demands or conflict about money could still send me spiraling into anxiety. My relationship with Sandra remained a work in progress, complicated by decades of damage that couldn't be undone overnight. But each day brought new opportunities to choose differently than I had been taught, to respond from a place of strength rather than fear, to build financial and emotional prosperity on my own terms. The card that declined that night at Bellagio hadn't been a sign of my failure but of my freedom. It marked the moment I stopped paying for my own abuse, both literally and figuratively. The bill Harold ultimately received came not from my bank account but from a justice system he couldn't manipulate or control. As I watch the sunset from my garden, I think about all the others still trapped in cycles of financial abuse, using their resources to fund their own mistreatment. If my story helps even one person recognize their situation and find the courage to break free, then every painful moment will have served a greater purpose. What about you? Have you ever found yourself giving away your power, your resources, or your dignity to someone who didn't deserve them? Have you stayed in a harmful situation because you were financially entangled? Or have you broken free and reclaimed your independence? Share your experience in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Your journey matters and your freedom is worth fighting for. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the strength to write your own ending, whatever challenges you face.